Our next session will focus on models for integrating science and ethics. And to kick us off, we are joined by Dr. Deborah Johnson, the Anne Shirley Carter Olson Professor of Applied Ethics in the Science, Technology, and Society program at the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences at the University of Virginia. In her research, she examines the ethical, social, and policy implications of technology and engineering. She was awarded the Sterling Olmsted Award from the Liberal Education Division of the American Society of Engineering Education. In 2001, she received that was in 2001. Subsequently, she received the John Barwise Prize from the American Philosophical Association in 2004. She's also served as a member of the Executive Board of the Association for Practical and Professional Ethics, and we're delighted to have you here. Welcome.
Yes, thank you. Let me begin by saying that how pleased I am to be here. I've followed the commission since its inception, have read several reports. I'm really impressed with the ability of the commission to craft those reports to be substantive on really tough issues. So as I understand my task here, it's to help the commission think through the challenges of addressing ethical issues early on in technological development and throughout the development. Although brain research is not my domain, I have to say that up front, there's no doubt in my mind that it's important to think about the ethical issues now and to continue to think about them as research and development progresses. And to think boldly about them with an eye, in my mind, with an eye to influencing the direction of development and the design of the technologies that will be developed. That'll be a theme throughout. As I understand it, the President's initiative is rightly framed without a sharp distinction between science and technology, or science and engineering, and without a sharp distinction between pure and applied research. The absence of these distinctions will, I think, make it easier to create a dialogue on the social, ethical, and legal issues, since I think that ideology sometimes gets in the way. If ethical issues aren't addressed intentionally and explicitly and thoughtfully, and if they aren't addressed early on, then I think the ethical aspects of the new technologies will be framed and shaped and possibly solidified implicitly by engineers and scientists, and probably through the press and public reaction. In other words, the ethical issues are going to be there, whether explicitly addressed or not. In my own recent research, I've been
Deborah, may I ask if we might have you bring the microphone just a little closer?
Okay.
Your words are powerful and your voice is soft-spoken.
I've been told that before. Okay, how's this? Okay. In my own recent research, I've been working on issues having to do with responsibility for artificial agents. That's just a general term for robots and bots and other computational devices. In focusing on the issues of responsibility, my work has largely been a reaction to some implications in the early literature that these technologies were being framed, at least by some actors involved, as so complex and so autonomous that the standard ascriptions of responsibility wouldn't work. I thought, and I still think, we might have a situation in which the public is told that no humans that is, are responsible for the behavior of devices that make these powerful and important decisions that affect our lives. My approach has been premised on the idea that design makes a difference. In my case, the artificial agents case, we can design artificial agents to facilitate human responsibility, or we can design them to make it harder and harder for humans to control and be accountable for their behavior. In other words, ethical issues, or at least the makings of ethical issues, I would argue, are constituted in the design of the technologies and can be constituted with or without particular problems. And I would assume it will be the case, the same for the design of brain technologies, though I don't know enough to give you the examples and the details. I mention my own work here because I think it's important, no matter what the technology, to recognize that although nature, the brain, in my case, computation, materiality, powerfully shapes what is technologically possible, it doesn't entirely dictate the character or design of the technologies that are produced. My work on artificial agents also illustrates the importance of framing technology not just as artifacts or material objects, but as socio-technical. Whether it's brain technologies or computational devices, technologies are systems in which results or effects are produced by combinations of human and non-human activity. Machines perform certain tasks, and humans perform certain tasks. The design of the technologies constitutes social relationships and social arrangements. It facilitates and constrains various modes of behavior, shape ways of thinking, and materializes social values. In the case of brain research, obviously the technologies developed and used will provide access to the brain, and in so doing, will shape the nature of knowledge about the brain. The technologies will also constitute relationships between those who use the technologies and those on whom the technologies are used, and will also affect how all of us think about ourselves and others and our relationships to one another. All of this you probably know already. I'm sure you do. Although I suspect you're aware of this, let me mention how important several programs have been in focusing attention on social, ethical, and legal issues in technology, and especially emerging technologies. To my mind, the legislation creating the National Nanotechnology Initiative was a seminal moment insofar as it specified that research under the initiative would include activities that ensured that ethical, legal, environmental, and other appropriate social concerns would be addressed, and insofar as possible that these considerations would be integrated with nanotechnology R&D. I don't know how much this has influenced the development of nanotechnology, but the legislative mandate, coupled with funding, has produced a significant body of knowledge, and that body of knowledge has generated a broad conversation about anticipatory governance and anticipatory ethics. The NNI legislation created a new group of ethics researchers, but it also drew on a group of scholars who had been supported by a National Science Foundation program, which has, if any of you are familiar with it, has been variously named, its name changed many times. It was EVIST, SDEST, EVS, and now it's STS. The NNI and the NSF program have been critically important in giving support as well as legitimacy to scholars and researchers focused on technology ethics. These researchers often work in environments in which funded research and the imprimatur of NSF has enormous cachet. This is, I think, important to keep in mind. Nevertheless, as we've learned from nanotechnology and from synthetic biology and other so-called emerging technologies, the challenges of doing ethics early on and alongside the development of technology are significant. The most daunting challenge, which has been mentioned already a number of times, has to do with the fact that the work involves identifying and analyzing issues related to things that aren't yet particular things, specific things. Ironically, sometimes the reason a developing technology doesn't materialize as predicted is precisely because those involved recognize a social or ethical or more commonly legal issue that can be avoided by taking another direction in the research or the design of the technology. A second challenge of doing ethics early on is using moral concepts that are malleable in certain ways. In my own research, the malleability of such concepts as privacy, responsibility, fairness, autonomy have all come into play. Some resist this idea that moral concepts are malleable because they think I'm asserting some sort of relativism. However, the reality is that when moral concepts are used in particular contexts and in relation to new technologies, they have to be interpreted or extended or modified in ways that are complicated. I actually have an example here that we can use Rawls makes a distinction between concepts and conceptions. I think most of the work that applies to technologies, and I would think to the BRAIN initiative, has to do with developing conceptions of sort of generic concepts. In any case, in addition to the fluidity of technological development and the malleability of moral concepts, is the challenge of getting ethical ideas explicitly into the activity of design and the discussion of new technologies in useful ways. In part, the problem is the same as for any interdisciplinary endeavor. As you all know, and was mentioned earlier, research scientists and engineers and ethicists tend to speak different languages and operate in somewhat different cultures. Here the challenge is to create space, forums, language, legitimacy for reflection and discussion of ethical issues, and in such a way that it penetrates the design and development activity. A number of activities with diverse labels are used for this. Anticipatory governance, anticipatory ethics, values in design, responsible innovation, real-time technology assessment, discourse analysis. The overarching idea in all of these, and I think this is probably the most useful thing to say, is that they all involve a kind of reflexivity. That is, bringing to the research and development activity a form of reflection on itself. This stepping back to reflect can be done, excuse me, by those engaged in, well, I'll do it quickly since my time is, by those who are inside doing the research, scientists and engineers, or by those outside. And most of the people who have done this in the past have say that the best thing is to engage these two groups. Again, I'm sure you know this from bioethics. So let me end just by saying that I was going to, if I had more time, I'd talk a little bit about the kinds of activities that have been undertaken in the case of technology, other technologies. And let me emphasize the importance of ongoing monitoring of this activity, not just in the early stages, but ongoing. And let me stop there.
Deborah, thank you. Thank you for demonstrating that engineers can think ethically. Our next speaker is Tom Murray, Dr. Thomas Murray. He is President Emeritus of the Hastings Center, where he served as President and CEO from 1999 until 2012. He's also former director of the Center for Biomedical Ethics in the School of Medicine at Case Western Reserve University. He currently serves as principal investigator of the Hastings Center's Project on Ethics and Synthetic Biology. He received the Henry Knowles Beecher Award from the Hastings Center in 2012 and the Patricia Price Brown Prize in 2013. Welcome and welcome back.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Jim. And hello to old friends and to other folks that I've just more recently met. It's really a pleasure to be here. So I want to thank you for the invitation, and I want to thank the staff of the Commission for their help in tracking down a variety of articles that looked at the Genome ELSI program. I've been asked, as I understand it, to reflect on the Genome Ethical, Legal, and Social Issues, aka ELSI program, and what lessons there might be from that if we were to undertake, for whatever we might undertake to sort of help think about ethical, legal, and social issues in a neuroscience initiative. So let me do that. My history with this goes back 25 years to a congressional hearing where I had been asked to, I'd been called by a congressional staffer, a scientist, who said, you know, we're planning to map and sequence all human DNA. We think there might be some ethical issues involved in that. We'll give you 5 minutes to talk about it. And I laughed and I said, I can't do that in 5 minutes. And she said, you can have 10 minutes, as you've given me. And if Congress, if the panel's interested.
See how generous we are.
You are so good. If the panel's interested, they'll ask questions and there'll be a conversation. So I arrived at this hearing not knowing who else was going to be there. And two of my fellow panelists were Jim Watson and Victor McCusick. So I gave my testimony, and in that testimony, I sort of tried to deal with what I thought were phony issues and set them aside, and then talk about the ones that I thought were likely to be real issues. And I had three categories. I'll close my remarks this morning with those three categories. And I said it would be really wonderful if for the first time in human history, an effort to think about the ethical, legal, and social issues was actually alongside the science itself. Only a tiny proportion of the resources that were poured into the science could be given to some such program. It would be a wonderful thing. And as I recall, the meeting, Congress talked about two things. They wanted to know, remember this is about 87, 88. They wanted to know if Japan would steal the results of the Genome Project. This was after the VCRs and such. And the second was ethical issues. So Jim Watson's a savvy person, and I'm not sure to what extent that had an impact on what ultimately he proposed, but he announced that there would be a 3% set aside for the ELSI program in the NIH portion, and it was ultimately increased to 5%. Now, the important thing to recognize is the ELSI Genome Program was never one thing. It was at least three different things. There was an ELSI working group. For the first number of years, I was a member for 5 years. That was the full term you could serve. That was a group that was advising the genome. At that point, it was a genome center. There was a working group. There was an investigator-initiated research operation, typical sort of NIH investigator-initiated research, peer-reviewed, et cetera. And then ultimately, there became a staff-driven policy office at the Genome Institute. So there were at least those three components. Now, I'll mention each of those in a moment, but think in terms of what the right model is for an ELSI program. And I don't claim to have the right answer. I'll just mention three possibilities. One the metaphor I've often used is thinking of the people who do ethics work as the fellow who follows the elephant in the circus parade with a shovel, and the job is to go in and clean up. It would be nice if you could at least walk alongside the elephant. It's still an elephant, and you're still a lot smaller, but you might try to nudge it or lead it. So that's one model. A second model, and I think this is a model that at least some scientists would prefer, and that is to be a kind of handmaiden, or if you know the sport of curling, the person who goes in front and sweeps the obstructions away so that the curling stone can go where you want it to go. And they'd like to be able to go where they want it to go, and they'd like the ethics types to make sure that it got there safely. A model that, they have their merits. A model that I have proposed is, I borrowed the concept from Michael Walzer, is the prophetic model. And here I don't mean wondrous predictions. I mean rather Old Testament prophet work, which is figuring out when your community is falling short of its own values and telling them that. So the work of an ethics panel can be quite critical of an ELSI program, including critical of the activities or at least the direction that they see the science headed in. And some combination of those is probably right, and you may have better ideas for models, but those are the three I would mention. Now, the working group, they had at least three, now back to the three components. The working group did at least three things. Note, it had an insurance task force that looked at genetic information and insurance. I ended up chairing that task force. We did a report on genetic information and health insurance. Happy to talk about that later. I think that was a solid piece of work. NIH had no idea what to do with it in terms of policy. They weren't even sure they wanted to acknowledge it. Later on, they embraced it. A second thing we did was we saw a number of different institutes funding research on cystic fibrosis testing, but they were not coordinating it. And so we sort of corralled them and said, you need to collaborate. And so a CF consortium grew out of our pressure. And a third accomplishment was we pushed I guess it ended up as an administrative clarification, so it didn't have to go through Congress, to the Americans with Disabilities Act, so that having a genetic predisposition to disease would now be regarded as a disability under the ADA and therefore afforded its protection. And that turned out to be significant for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in the Burlington Northern case. Attention all the way through, by the way, was whether genetics and genetic information should be seen as just another kind of health-related information, or whether it should be seen as somehow special and exceptional. I attacked genetic exceptionalism, which did not make me popular in some circles of the Genome Project. I would say the main accomplishment of the Genome professional staff was the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. It's a statute. They're quite proud of it. I think I'm ambivalent about it. Now, one of the chief criticisms directed against the investigator-initiated research component was that it was insufficiently effective in policy shaping. Now, here I'm reminded of the scene in Casablanca where Captain Renault goes in and he says, "I'm shocked to discover that gambling is going on in this place." Anyone who thinks that the way to make policy is through investigator-initiated research is culpably naive. That's not what it does best. If all you want is policy, then you shouldn't do that. If, however, you're interested in fostering a dialogue and creating a creative tension among a community of scholars in science, engineering, the humanities, and the social sciences, it can be a wonderful instrument. It will expand our shared knowledge in basic research in the humanities and social sciences. And just as basic research in the neurosciences initiative is foundationally important, I would argue the same will be true of research in the humanities and social sciences here. But when you design such a program, be very mindful of the institutional and professional forces that will bear on any such research program. Over time, those of us who did the conceptual and normative work felt that Genome-ELSI had become less hospitable to that line of work and was more interested in funding empirical research, which seemed more comfortable and which, again, was out there sweeping so that the stone could get to where you wanted it. A central question is, what should an ELSI program aspire to accomplish? And a second question is, how can we tell if it's successful? And here I list 4 categories. One is public policy. What I found is, astonishingly often, people like me were called upon to be wet blankets. And that's the comments about hype earlier are very relevant here. We would get calls sometimes from Congress, sometimes from journalists, wanting to say, well, what's going to happen with A, B, or C? And we'd say, well, it's not here yet. Or don't expect immediate wondrous effects here. A second will be over science policy. And here it might be about priorities, it might be about the conduct of research, human subject protection, fairness, and avoiding exploitation. There are a number of things there. The third will be over public engagement and understanding. And a fourth will be sort of mapping the terrain, identifying issues, and deepening understanding of those issues. Now, I see my time is just about up. So I'll hold my recommendations for later, if you want them, and mention the 3 categories that seemed relevant to me 25 years ago about the Genome Project, because it still seems relevant. One will be the avalanche of information. It was genetic information back then. At that point, you had mainly a few pebbles careening down the hill, but it's really picked up volume now, and we're near the $1,000 genome. In the brain sciences, I think we're way beyond where we were 25 years ago in genome sciences in terms of this avalanche of information, understanding it, assessing it, using it in ways that help, not hurt people. A second major category is enhancement. Will these technologies be used to try to affect human physiology, anatomy, interactions in ways that may be wise or unwise? And the third was genetic apology, that is the use of the scientific information to sometimes explain away things like enduring differences among populations, sometimes explaining away behavior, sometimes rationalizing social policies or practices, and we need to be mindful of all 3 of those. The one I did not anticipate, but has turned out to be quite important, Warren's mentioned, and that is the issues of intellectual property and commercialization. And that ultimately got added to the genome agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, there it goes. Okay. I guess we can only have 2 on at a time. Thank you, Tom. And we will, in fact, want to get back to your recommendations on this. Our final speaker, I've just lost the intro for. Do you have it handy?
I have it.
I'm sorry, Anjan.
There you go. Paper.
Very good. And he is Dr. Anjan Chatterjee. He is professor of neurology and a member of the Center for Cognitive Neuroscience and Center for Neuroscience and Society here at Penn, University of Pennsylvania. He is on the editorial boards of numerous professional journals and was awarded the 2002 Norman Geschwind Prize in Behavioral and Cognitive Neurology by the American Academy of Neurology. He's a founding member of the Board of Governors of the Neuroethics Society and is the president of the Behavioral and Cognitive Neurology Society. His research focuses on spatial cognition and language, attention to neuroethics and aesthetics, and we're delighted to have you here. Welcome, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Traveling here was grueling. So when we think about translational medicine, typically this is the axis that we think about, which is that advances in basic sciences in the bench get translated to the bedside, and questions that arise at the bedside guide the kind of bench research. And advances along this axis are providing deliverables, and I'll be very concrete about the kind of deliverables we're talking about. A month ago, I was the neurology attending on the ward here, and literally about 100 yards from here, I walked into a patient's room. She was in her mid-50s. She was disheveled. She was manic. She was delusional. There were papers strewn all over her bed and across the floor. And she had even scribbled on her own body with the ballpoint pen all sorts of messages. And here she was on a neurology ward. What she had was a particular immune-mediated encephalitis where she was producing antibodies to the NMDA receptor. And this is a disorder that even 10 years ago we knew virtually nothing about. And now we have a fairly good sense of the mechanisms involved and how to treat it. Okay, so this is an example of what I would suggest that this advances in biomedical research and translational medicine has the potential to deliver. But what I would like to do in this talk is to expand the notion of translation, that it is not simply between bench and bedside, and that there is a kind of translation of information that extends beyond that. And much of what I talk about has been touched on in various points in this morning's talk. So one is the translation of this information to commerce. And in that context, we can think about the ways in which there are synergies. There are certainly, every research university right now is trying to partner with industry. There are certain synergies, but we shouldn't be blind to the kinds of conflicts that arise. And one is the way in which neuroscience can be sold. We've heard about hype. And so a couple of examples of the way neuroscience is being sold right now. The first category I would suggest is that there are things being sold where they have plausible hypotheses for why they might be effective. And brain games are a good example of this. Probably everybody around this table has some little concern about as your gray hairs increase on your head, the possibility of developing dementing illness. Brain games are big business right now, and in fact, there are even there are applications for mobile devices being used. And while there are plausible scientific rationales for this, the evidence in support of their efficacy is thin at best. The second perhaps might be regarded as particularly egregious, which is the use of certain neuroimaging technologies. And in particular, I'll talk about SPECT as they're used in the diagnosis and management of neuropsychiatric illnesses. It turns out right now there are clinics across the country that are using this and saying, and presenting this with a very compelling logic. And the logic is the following. If you had a broken bone and went to see an orthopedic surgeon, you wouldn't trust them if they didn't get a picture of your bones before they operated on you. So how could you possibly go to someone who is trying to fix your dysfunctional brain if they don't do a functional brain imaging? It just doesn't make sense. And of course, the logic of this is completely flawed. But this, again, is big business. There's a whole category of clinics around the country that are using this. These are not paid for by insurance companies, as they should not be. But people are willing to pay several $1,000s for this kind of technology. So that's one way in which we can expand the notion of translation into commerce. The second, as also has been touched on, is how this information, as it grows and as it will grow, gets translated into cultural norms. And the one example of this, there are many, but the one I will touch on, which has been brought up several times today, is this notion of enhancement. And we have ways in which we can enhance our motor systems, motor learning, attention to some extent, memory to some extent. We can modify our emotional reactions to situations. And much of this discussion has been in the context of pharmaceutical interventions. But what is coming down the pike is the way in which non-invasive brain stimulation will be used exactly in the same way. In the academic literature, there have been increasing papers talking about the same ways that you can manipulate our abilities using non-invasive brain stimulation. These are cheap, these are easy, and in fact, even in the last couple of months, there has been a company that is marketing devices that you can buy. You can completely bypass any kind of institutional, any medical or institutional venue to actually get this. And it is being framed as wearable technology as opposed to a medical device, right? So you can go out and get your Google glasses, and you can get your little TDCS machine that you can wear on your head and do what you want to. And to point out, for those of you that might be concerned about, for example, doping in sports, it is not at all obvious right now how you would monitor this, right? It's not the same as actually doing a drug test. It's not clear how this would be monitored if you think that there is a problem with this and it should be monitored. And the kind of ethical issues that arise, these have been discussed certainly in the context of pharmacology, but I think apply for these other ways as well, which has to do with safety. There are questions of justice and fairness, who has access to this. There are questions of potential erosions to character if the effort, the link between effort and achievement is undermined. There are questions of autonomy, which is that could it be the case that under some circumstances we actually require people to use enhancements with the argument that it is for the greater good. And so the question I think you can ask is, what, if anything, should we do about this, given that the information, the translational information in a narrow sense is going to advance, and what do we do about these more broadly conceived notions of translation? The standard response, one would be regulation, and this is a question of exactly what do we regulate. The regulations around the development and implementation of drugs are reasonably well established, but things like devices less so. And if devices regarded as a fashion accessory, such as wearable technology, then it's not clear who actually does the regulating. Diagnostics, such as these SPECT scans, it's also not clear how the regulation happens. And I think in general for regulation, the issue always is getting it just right, a kind of Goldilocks principle, which is that you don't want too much to stifle innovation, but you don't want anything where there are no safeguards. But the other way to do this, I think, is something that at least I feel more comfortable with, and perhaps many people on the panel, which is education, that most of us are educators in some sort. And I would suggest that there are several ways that we can think about education. 30 years ago, when I was a medical student here at Penn, there was no ethical education. Like, it just wasn't built into the system. Since then, there have been greater access to ethical education for postgraduate education, for people who are studying neuroscience, for people who are in medical schools. But I suggest it's still very clunky, that it isn't really, it's sort of you get on a website and you answer a bunch of questions. There isn't the kind of deliberative engagement with ethical issues that you would think would be desirable. And I think part of the reason is that we do not think of ethical deliberation as a core competency for what it means to be a scientist and what it means to be a clinician. And until we establish that, I think we will continue to have these sort of clunky ways of doing things. And then finally is the question is, how do we get the public engaged and the public educated? Earlier, Dr. Gutman mentioned public assurance. I think one way to get public assurance is to have public engagement, and the only way to have reasonable public engagement is to have the public educated, right? So when they look at this, they're given this logic of the orthopedic surgeon and the psychiatrist. They look at this and say, this doesn't make sense. And how do we do that? And I would suggest that at least one piece of that is that people that are working neuroscientists, working clinicians, need to engage with the public directly. And at this point, there is just no incentive to do so. If you are, in my own case, as an academic physician here, there is no incentive for me to engage the public. And so I would suggest, as far as policy matters, that would be an important way, because a lot of these will play out based on societal and cultural norms, and the only way we can get to a place with that is to have an educated populace. Thanks.
Dr. Chatterjee, thank you. The three of you have given us a lot to squeeze into the little bit of time that's left for this preliminary discussion before we go to the larger panel. But I do want to open the floor for questions directed specifically to one or more of our three. Yes, Anita.
Tom, I'm your Forrest Gump, I think, because I was sort of hovering around ELSI and the National Advisory Committee on Human Genome Research. I was, for a time, the panel's ex officio member of the ELSI working group, which was conceived as a subcommittee of the larger group that was funding all the better and faster sequencing. And I have a memory that maybe it's a false memory. I mean, I do remember your insurance group and how excited we were to be able to address the implications of the BRCA 1 and 2, the discovery, and that was great. And I don't recall the cystic fibrosis episode or component, but here's what I do remember. This goes to the larger question about how we integrate ethics in science or fail to do so. What I seem to remember is that the reason why the ELSI working group was ultimately disbanded in favor of a staff-driven policy group was that the ELSI working group was pushing to discuss hot-button questions about genetics, such as behavioral genetics, genetic foundations of intelligence, genetic foundations of criminality. And because we're talking about the federal government, these weren't topics that the government was eager to have being grappled with, but yet some members of the ELSI working group thought these were really important questions, just as important as insurance and disability rights. Do you have any memory of this? And in light of, if you do remember this, what is the lesson in that for whether or not government-sponsored science can include meaningful, important, broad ethics?
Terrific question, Anita. So the working group was founded in about 90, and Nancy Wexler was the chair. Nancy, famous from her work in Huntington.
Yes.
And by 95, we were gone, and
Right.
we were replaced by Lori Andrews as the new chair and a new group.
Correct.
That's when this ultimately, when it was
Disbanded.
when it was disbanded. Yeah, but I was very much in contact. And your memory, I think, is correct. When it was a desire to press some controversial issues that made people uncomfortable, and this. That's why, so I'll give you one of my recommendations then. If you are interested in keeping an ELSI program vibrantly engaged with issues that might be controversial and might be more policy relevant, you want to create a variety of venues. I think you shouldn't attempt to rely on the investigator-initiated research program. That's not what they do best. But you should have a variety of venues. You might have commissions, ad hoc panels, advisory bodies, executive offices, and they should emphasize inclusiveness, multiple voices, transparency, and policy savvy. They ought to have those things. And be aware that there is going to be tension, there is going to be conflict, and the institutional pressures of a government entity are always going to push against that. They want to bury the controversial stuff. And you just have, I don't know, you have to have different ways of funding these different things. So as an ad hoc task force, we could do controversial stuff. I have the insurance task force, right? And I had to beg for money for every meeting, and usually got it, but we managed to do a report. So I would just say, we need many voices and many venues if you want to stay engaged with controversial issues.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, please. Yes, Deborah.
So I agree with what Tom said, but I want to push for, in the nanotechnology area and in my own stuff on technology, there's been a push to get much closer to the point of contact. That is to embed people in the research labs where you both develop their expertise with the technologies, but also where just simple asking questions, thinking about, so I just wanted to add that.
Point well made, and I think it's one we want to remember. There may be many fronts on which to address the issue.
Actually, thank you, all three of you, first of all. My question kind of builds on that a little bit. I was interested, Dr. Chatterjee, that you mentioned regulation and education, but you didn't mention research. And so we live in a world, of course, where it's hard to get foundational bioethics research funded. And I think it's actually getting increasingly harder because money is tight. And yet this seems to me an area where that kind of research might be very valuable. So I wonder, both from your perspective of translation, from Tom's perspective of what happened in ELSI, and from the two initiatives that you described, the NNI and the NSF project, what you think about sort of foundational ethical research and where it should be supported. Who should support it?
I think it should be supported. I guess there are different kinds of ways of thinking through what that research might entail. One is the kind of conceptual clarification, laying out of ideas that's scholarly work but not empirical, right? But I also think there is a role for empirical work in this, and particularly to understand what sort of prevailing societal norms are, even of how people are thinking about this. And I think this ties back into this notion of public engagement. I think is absolutely critical, because many of these issues will be decided by societal norms, and until there is some consensus or at least clarity about what those societal norms are, it's not clear how we'll proceed. So I'll give you an example from sports. Most people don't like doping in professional sports, right? So there's all this stuff about baseball going on right now. On the other hand, if you look at bodybuilding competitions, everybody dopes. It's completely accepted. There are separate categories for people who do bodybuilding without doping, right? That's accepted. So how do we arrive at those places? What are people thinking? How do you educate them? I think that kind of empirical research, there's certainly a place for, and not enough of that happens.
I was avoiding the sports thing because I'm the chair of the ethics panel for the World Anti-Doping Agency. That's one. Yeah, a small thing, but so deeply embedded in this. And I think I'm writing a book about this, so I think ultimately the difference between bodybuilding or powerlifting and Olympic sports and Major League Baseball has to do with the meaning of the activity. And that's a very complex and socially embedded thing that one has to work out. But and I think that's important work to be done, and it doesn't happen in a flash, and not everybody, it needs research, it needs thought, it needs that kind of scholarly dialogue where you put an idea out there and somebody else knocks it down, and you reformulate it or you give it up. I mean, that's why I think it's essential to have a research program, to create this scholarly community that will be well informed about each other's way of thinking. This is what the Hastings Center has been masterful at for decades, is you have scientists, engineers, legal scholars, practitioners, philosophers, theologians, all engaged with one another.
I wonder if this would be a friendly addition. I mean, I would urge us not to make a sharp distinction between empirical and basic ethical research because, for example, the empirical distinction between bodybuilding and doping, unless you entertain the idea, which I will just throw out, that another distinction here is that doping is against the rules of some sports. And maybe it should and maybe it shouldn't be, but athletes who dope are trying surreptitiously to violate the rules. And I'm not sure, as an ethicist, as somebody who's studied moral and ethical philosophy, that there's a Platonic ideal out there that you should have a rule that you can't use these drugs and you can use a lot of other drugs. But I am sure, as somebody who studied both moral and legal and political philosophy, that it is really bad for sports, organized sports, who have great, seemingly great athletes who are role models for young children and older people alike, for them to be violating rules and trying to, just winning by cheating. And the reason I go on about this is that when we talk about basic ethical research, we often are funding research that doesn't use empirical examples. And when we talk about funding empirical research, we're often funding research that doesn't entertain ethical questions. And that's the same really destructive dichotomy as the extreme dichotomy between brain and mind, and which is the very subject of our ethical investigation. So I just felt called upon to make that statement, which I hope you agree with, but I think it does call on us to, if we're going to call for, which I think we should call for, the funding of some kind of ELSI, project to do two things. One is I would very much take Arjan's thing that it has to be an educational ELSI, not just scooping up the manure or clearing the way, but having the actual researchers be educated and feel that they're ethical engineers and ethical scientists. And secondly, that it not have this stark dichotomy, which is a false dichotomy, a destructive dichotomy between basic ethical research and empirical research.
Well said, Amy. In its best, sort of the kind of interdisciplinary research which the Hastings Center helped pioneer and which often occurred in the ELSI project did just that. It brought the people from all these different, the empirical, the conceptual, normative, all together in a very creative. It was always a tension because we go at the world in different ways. We have different ways of thinking about the world. We have different methodologies. Coming to appreciate the insights that those different frames of mind and methodologies can contribute to the larger practical question is wonderful. It's a joyous occasion when that happens. The institutional pressures of a peer-reviewed program by a scientific agency push towards the empirical. That's all. That's so that you're going to have to, if you want to keep that tension alive, and if I leave you nothing else, to keep that creative tension alive. That's the point I want to drive home. It's going to require continual work and maintenance.
If I could just address that, of course I agree, and I think this is similar to when people, if you're doing cognitive neuroscience research, for example, which is that data just doesn't appear, right? Regardless of our faith in big science, right? It's not going to just deliver understanding, and it's predicated on having a pretty decent theory about what you're testing. And I would say that this is analogous in the sense that you really need to have a firm conceptual base to even know what to look at empirically. And the kind of dialogues that Tom is talking about is absolutely critical.
Just for quick clarification, Amy slipped in something I thought was pretty significant when she was talking about the kind of LC that we might entertain as a commission. It originally had been, Tom, you had talked about it as serving a prophetic role, but what you slipped in is that it should also be serving this educational role along the lines, it seems to me, Deborah, what you have been talking about, to ensure that even at the basic science or engineering lab bench, there is awareness and commitment.
Well, if I can, I'm not sure I understand the discussion that's going on, frankly, because I'm worried that the ELSI model, which I don't in any way want to critique. I mean, I think, but and this goes back to your question, it depends on what we're trying to do here. If what you want is a group of people who keep alive the issues and write about them and think about it, and you develop expertise in the neuroethics, that's one thing. But if what you want to do is sort of impact the initiative, you'd have to get inside. You have to actually have people who aren't in an enclave of expertise, but who are willing to, I mean, my mission in life has been to impact engineers. And so you have to get in there with them. Now, there is the problem of being co-opted once you're in there. So you need both. I mean, you need the...
I don't think, I think there is a misunderstanding here of what, I'm going to call it an educational LC because I just think it's important that it educate public and it educate practitioners. And I don't, while it is important that it exists alongside of individual experts in ethics being embedded in enterprises, those individual experts embedded in enterprises will be not only co-opted possibly, but just isolated if there isn't a collaborative group that is moving forward interesting and accurate research, practical research in ethics, in neuroethics. Otherwise, the whole understanding of what an ethical enterprise is in neuroscience is going to stagnate. I mean, it's not as if, although the ethical principles don't, the basic high-level principles don't change over millennia, the actual application, as you said, the conceptions that you have to use to move it forward need to keep up with the context and the science. So I don't think these ought to be seen as opposed. I think one is very they're complementary, and one, in fact, even more so, is dependent on the other. There's a symbiosis here.
Tom, we'll give you the last comment in this session.
I think this is all very clarifying. And in fact, an LC program, I tried to be, maybe I didn't make it as clear as I wanted to. You'll have multiple goals. You may want to affect public policy. You may want to build a body of research and create a community of scholars. You may want to do public engagement in education. Those can be synergistic, but they require different strategies to achieve them individually. And so I really want to lay out a challenge. If there is going to be a kind of LC program for this neuroscience initiative, it's 25 years on. Take advantage of the changes in new media, in social media. Find ways to engage and educate the public that we just did not have. We did not have the possibility of doing when the Genome LC program began. It seems like the possibilities are so rich. It's probably going to require a 20-year-old to figure out how to do it. But it seems a wonderful thing. And also, don't fall prey to the deficit model. The deficit model is, if we could only explain it better, if they would listen to us better, then they will understand what's going on and why they should let us do it. That's not the way to go about it. We have to really engage and listen as well.
I want the three of you to stay right where you are even as you accept our thanks for your presentation this morning.